When Marcel Dubois, the proud owner of one of Washington's most exclusive restaurants, saw a man in a cheap suit with a thick Southern accent walk through his doors, he ordered him out without a second thought. What he didn't know was that he had just humiliated one of the most powerful senators in America, and 24 hours later, he would regret it for the rest of his life. The rain was coming down in steady sheets across downtown Washington, D.C., turning the normally bustling streets into rivers of reflected neon and hurried umbrellas. It was the kind of October evening that made even the most hardened political operatives want to find shelter and warmth, preferably with a good meal and a moment's peace from the relentless pace of the nation's capital. Senator John Neely Kennedy pulled his modest sedan into a parking space 3 blocks from his intended destination, checking his watch as he gathered his umbrella and briefcase. It had been one of those days that seemed designed to test a man's patience and resolve. 3 committee hearings, 2 press conferences, and a series of phone calls with increasingly frustrated constituents back home in Louisiana had left Kennedy feeling drained in a way that went beyond simple physical fatigue. The political battles of Washington had a way of wearing on the soul, and tonight he wanted nothing more than a quiet meal somewhere he could think without being recognized, questioned, or pulled into yet another political discussion. Kennedy's destination was Bernardin DC, an upscale French restaurant that had recently opened to considerable fanfare among Washington's elite. He'd heard about it from a colleague who'd mentioned that despite its reputation for exclusivity, the food was exceptional and the atmosphere conducive to quiet conversation. Kennedy wasn't particularly impressed by status symbols or celebrity chefs, but after the day he'd had, the prospect of a well-prepared meal in peaceful surroundings held considerable appeal. As he walked through the rain-soaked streets, Kennedy cut an unassuming figure. His navy blue suit was well-tailored but hardly expensive, the kind of practical garment a man might wear to work every day without worrying about impressing anyone. His shoes were comfortable rather than fashionable, and his umbrella was a simple black model that had seen better days. To any casual observer, he looked like exactly what he was, a working man who happened to spend his days in the halls of Congress rather than in a factory or office building. The restaurant's exterior was understated but elegant, with soft lighting spilling out onto the wet sidewalk through large windows that revealed glimpses of white tablecloths and crystal stemware. Kennedy folded his umbrella and pushed through the heavy glass doors, immediately hit by a wave of warm air that carried the complex aromas of fine cooking and expensive wine. The interior was everything he'd expected from an establishment of this caliber: soft lighting, tasteful artwork, and the kind of hushed conversation that spoke of serious money and serious influence. Behind the host stand stood Marcel Dubois, though Kennedy had no way of knowing the man's name or the significance of his presence. Dubois was in his late 50s, with the kind of perfectly groomed appearance that spoke of careful attention to detail and considerable vanity. His salt and pepper hair was styled to artful perfection, and his tailored suit probably cost more than most people earned in a month. Everything about his bearing suggested a man who took great pride in his position as gatekeeper to one of Washington's most exclusive dining establishments. Dubois had spent 15 years building his reputation in the restaurant business, first in New York and then in Washington, where he discovered that politics and fine dining created a particularly lucrative combination. His clientele included senators, Supreme Court justices, cabinet members, and the kind of wealthy lobbyists who thought nothing of spending $1,000 on dinner for 2. He prided himself on knowing exactly who belonged in his establishment and who didn't, and he'd never hesitated to turn away anyone who didn't meet his exacting standards. When Kennedy approached the host stand, Dubois' reaction was immediate and visceral. He took in the senator's modest appearance, the off-the-rack suit, the simple tie, the slight dampness from the rain, and felt a familiar surge of irritation. This was exactly the kind of person who would lower the tone of his carefully curated establishment. The man's thick Louisiana accent, which became apparent the moment he spoke, only confirmed Dubois' initial assessment. "Good evening," Kennedy said politely, water still beating on his shoulders from the rain outside. "I was hoping you might have a table available for one. I know I don't have a reservation, but I was hoping—" "I'm sorry," Dubois interrupted, his tone making it clear that he wasn't sorry at all. "We're completely booked this evening. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at one of the establishments down the street." His eyes swept over Kennedy's appearance again, and his lip curled slightly in barely concealed disdain. They might be more suitable to your needs." Kennedy blinked, momentarily taken aback by the hostility in the man's voice. He glanced around the restaurant, noting several empty tables scattered throughout the dining room. The place was busy but hardly packed, and he could see at least 3 tables that could easily accommodate a single diner. "I can see there are several tables available," he said carefully, his southern politeness intact despite the obvious slight. "I'd be happy to wait if there's a reservation coming in." Dubois' expression hardened. In his experience, people who didn't take the first hint usually required a more direct approach. "Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "This is Bernardin DC. We cater to a very specific clientele, and frankly, I don't think you'd be comfortable here. The prices alone." He let the sentence hang in the air, the implication clear. The conversation was beginning to attract attention from nearby diners, who turned in their seats to observe the increasingly tense exchange. Kennedy could feel their eyes on him, and he recognized the familiar Washington dynamic of spectacle and judgment. Still, he maintained his composure, though there was a slight tightening around his eyes that suggested his patience was wearing thin. "I appreciate your concern about my comfort," Kennedy said, his voice still level but carrying a slight edge now. "But I assure you that I can afford to eat here, and I'd very much like to try your food. If you could just check to see if anything becomes available." "Look," Dubois said, stepping out from behind the host stand and moving closer to Kennedy. His voice was louder now, clearly intended to be overheard by the dining room. "I don't know what kind of establishment you think this is, but we have standards here. This isn't some roadside diner where you can just wander in wearing," he gestured dismissively at Kennedy's suit, "whatever that is, and expect to be seated among our regular clientele." The dining room had gone noticeably quieter now, with conversations trailing off as more and more patrons turned to watch the unfolding drama. Kennedy could see a mixture of expressions among the onlookers. Some seemed uncomfortable with Dubois' obvious hostility, while others appeared to be enjoying the spectacle of someone they perceived as an outsider being put in his place. Kennedy took a deep breath, clearly struggling to maintain his composure in the face of such blatant rudeness. "Sir, I'm not looking for any special treatment. I just want to have dinner. If there's a dress code I'm not meeting, I'd be happy to." "The dress code is the least of your problems," Dubois snapped, his voice rising further. "This restaurant serves senators, cabinet members, Supreme Court justices. We host dinners for foreign ambassadors and Fortune 500 CEOs. What we don't do is serve people who clearly don't understand what this establishment represents." He paused, looking Kennedy up and down once more with undisguised contempt. "I'm going to ask you to leave now, before this becomes more unpleasant than it needs to be. I'm sure there are plenty of places more suited to your circumstances. Somewhere else in the city." Kennedy stood perfectly still for a long moment, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that was somehow both respectful and dignified. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet enough that the surrounding diners had to strain to hear him. But there was something in his tone that commanded attention. "I see," he said simply. "And you're certain that this is how you want to handle this situation?" Dubois laughed, a sound that was meant to be dismissive but came across as nervous. "I'm certain that I want you to leave my restaurant, right now." Kennedy nodded slowly, as if processing this information carefully. "Very well. I suppose I'll have to find somewhere else to eat tonight." He turned toward the door, then paused and looked back at Dubois. "I do hope you won't regret this decision." "Trust me," Dubois called after him, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent dining room. "I won't lose any sleep over it." Kennedy walked out into the rain without another word, leaving behind a restaurant full of diners who were buzzing with excitement over the drama they'd just witnessed. Several patrons approached Dubois to congratulate him on maintaining the restaurant's standards, while others returned to their meals with the satisfied air of people who'd just seen order properly maintained in their exclusive world. Dubois himself felt a surge of satisfaction as he returned to his host stand. He'd dealt with plenty of people who tried to gain access to his restaurant through persistence or pleading, and he'd never hesitated to remove them when they proved too stubborn to take a hint. Tonight had been no different, except perhaps for the man's unusual dignity in the face of rejection. Still, dignity didn't change the fact that he clearly didn't belong among Bernardin's sophisticated clientele. What Dubois didn't know, what he couldn't have known without askings, was that the man he'd just humiliated in front of a room full of Washington's elite was Senator John Neely Kennedy of Louisiana, a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee and one of the most respected voices in Congress. Kennedy's reputation for intellectual rigor and moral integrity had earned him influence far beyond what his modest appearance might suggest, and his network of relationships within Washington's power structure was both extensive and deep. As Kennedy walked through the rain toward his car, he wasn't thinking about revenge or retaliation. He was thinking about the broader implications of what had just occurred, the casual cruelty that had been displayed, the assumptions that had been made based on appearance and accent, and the way that a room full of supposedly sophisticated people had enjoyed watching someone be humiliated. It was, he reflected, a perfect microcosm of everything that was wrong with Washington's culture of elitism and exclusion. By the time Kennedy reached his car, he'd made a decision. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart, James Patterson, the senior investigative reporter for the Washington Post who'd been covering Capitol Hill for nearly 2 decades. Patterson answered on the second ring, recognizing Kennedy's number immediately. "Senator Kennedy, good evening. What can I do for you?" "James, I have a story for you," Kennedy said, settling into his car as the rain continued to drum against the windshield. "It's about a restaurant called Le Bernardin DC, and its owner, Marcel Dubois. I think you might find it interesting." Kennedy spent the next 20 minutes giving Patterson a detailed account of what had transpired, including the names of several prominent diners who had witnessed the incident. Patterson, who had a reputation for thoroughness, asked probing questions about the timeline, the exact words that had been used, and the reactions of other patrons. By the end of the conversation, he was already planning his approach to the story. "I'll need to verify a few details and get some background on this Dubois character," Patterson said. "But if what you're telling me is accurate, this could be a significant story. The Post has been looking into issues of discrimination and elitism in DC's high-end establishments." "I'm not looking for a personal vendetta, James," Kennedy clarified. "But I think the public has a right to know how their elected representatives are treated when they try to patronize establishments that benefit from this city's political economy." Patterson understood immediately. Kennedy wasn't just talking about personal slight, she was talking about systemic issues of access, privilege, and the way that Washington's service industry catered to power and wealth while excluding those who didn't fit a particular profile. Meanwhile, back at Le Bernardin, Dubois was enjoying one of the most profitable evenings in the restaurant's brief history. Word of the incident had spread quickly through Washington's social media networks, and several prominent diners had made additional reservations specifically to show their support for the restaurant's standards. Dubois felt vindicated in his decision to maintain what he saw as appropriate: exclusivity. That satisfaction lasted until approximately 10:30 the next morning, when James Patterson called the restaurant requesting comment for a story he was preparing about discrimination in DC's high-end dining establishments. Patterson was professional but direct, outlining the basic facts of Kennedy's experience the previous evening and asking for Dubois' response. "I'm sorry, who did you say the customer was?" Dubois asked, his voice suddenly much less confident than it had been the night before. "Senator John Neely Kennedy of Louisiana," Patterson repeated. "He's a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee and has been in Congress for over 6 years. According to multiple witnesses, you refused him service based on his appearance and then had him removed from the restaurant." The phone went silent for so long that Patterson wondered if the connection had been lost. When Dubois finally spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "There must be some mistake. The man who came in last night. He didn't identify himself as anyone important. He looked like. He was dressed like." "Like what, Mr. Dubois?" Patterson pressed. "Are you saying that you judge your customers based on their clothing and accents rather than their ability to pay or their right to service?" Dubois' mind was racing now, trying to process the magnitude of his error. He'd thrown out a sitting U.S. senator, not just any senator, but one who was widely respected even by his political opponents and who had significant influence over federal policy that could affect businesses like his own. The ramifications were beginning to dawn on him, and they were terrifying. We have certain standards. The clientele expects," Dubois stammered, unable to form a coherent defense for his actions. "Mr. Dubois, I'm going to run this story in tomorrow's edition," Patterson said matter-of-factly. I wanted to give you an opportunity to provide your side of the events. Would you like to make a statement?" After Patterson hung up, Dubois sat staring at his phone for several long minutes, his mind reeling with the implications of what he'd just learned. He built his entire business model around catering to Washington's power elite, and he just publicly humiliated one of the most influential members of that very community. The irony was devastating, but the practical consequences were likely to be even worse. Within hours of Patterson's story hitting the Washington Post's website, Bernardin DC was experiencing a crisis unlike anything Dubois had ever imagined. The story, headlined "Senator Denied Service at Exclusive DC Restaurant," quickly went viral on social media platforms, where it was shared thousands of times by users outraged by the blatant discrimination Kennedy had experienced. More damaging than the public outrage, however, was the reaction from Washington's political establishment. By noon, Dubois had received cancellations for 3 major events scheduled at the restaurant over the next month, including a fundraising dinner for a prominent senator and a reception for foreign ambassadors. His phone rang constantly with reporters seeking comment and former supporters distancing themselves from the establishment. Senator Kennedy, meanwhile, maintained his characteristic dignity throughout the media storm. When contacted by reporters for his reaction to the coverage, he declined to attack Dubois personally, but used the opportunity to discuss broader issues of respect and inclusion in American society. "This incident wasn't really about me," Kennedy told one reporter. "It was about the assumptions we make about people based on their appearance, their accent, or their background. I was fortunate enough to have the platform to tell my story, but there are countless Americans who face this kind of discrimination every day without any recourse." The story continued to generate coverage for several days, with editorial writers and political commentators using the incident to examine larger questions about elitism and discrimination in American society. Several other public figures came forward with their own stories of similar treatment at high-end establishments, creating a broader conversation about service industry discrimination. For Dubois, the consequences were swift and severe. Within a week of the story breaking, Bernardin DC had lost nearly 30% of its reservations, and several key staff members had resigned rather than be associated with the scandal. The restaurant's parent company, faced with mounting public relations damage and pressure from investors, made the decision to terminate Dubois' management contract. The final blow came when Kennedy himself, displaying the kind of grace that had characterized his response throughout the ordeal, issued a public statement expressing no ill will toward Dubois personally, while hoping that the incident would serve as a learning opportunity for others in the service industry. "I bear no grudge against Mr. Dubois," Kennedy's statement read. "I hope that he and others will use this as an opportunity to reflect on the importance of treating all customers with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance or background. That's not just good business, it's good humanity." The statement, which could have been Kennedy's moment of triumph over someone who had wronged him, instead became a demonstration of the kind of leadership and character that had earned him respect across party lines. It also made Dubois' earlier behavior look even more petty and foolish by comparison. As the weeks passed and the immediate media attention faded, the broader impact of the incident continued to resonate throughout Washington's service industry. Several establishments implemented new training programs focused on respectful customer service, while others began examining their own policies and practices to ensure they weren't inadvertently discriminating against potential customers. For Kennedy himself, the incident reinforced his commitment to representing all Americans, regardless of their background or status. He continued to frequent modest establishments throughout Washington, often noting that the quality of service had little to do with the price of the meal or the exclusivity of the venue. Marcel Dubois, meanwhile, eventually found work managing a small restaurant in suburban Virginia, far from the centers of power and influence he had once courted. The experience had taught him a harsh lesson about the dangers of judging people by their appearance, but it had come at a cost that would follow him for the rest of his career. The story of Senator Kennedy's treatment at Bernardin became a cautionary tale that was shared throughout Washington's hospitality industry, a reminder that in a city where power and influence often came in unexpected packages, treating every customer with respect wasn't just the right thing to do, it was essential for survival. Years later, when asked about the incident in interviews, Kennedy would often smile and note that he'd eventually found an excellent dinner that night at a small family-owned restaurant near his apartment, where the service was warm, The food was outstanding, and nobody cared what he was wearing or how he spoke. Sometimes, he would say, the best experiences come from the most unexpected places. You just have to be open to finding them. If this story of dignity overcoming prejudice touched your heart, please support our channel with a like and subscription. Every interaction helps us share more tales that remind us of the power of character, respect, and true leadership. Let's keep these important conversations alive, one story at a time.